The night did not begin with violence. It began with silence. A long empty highway stretched beyond the quiet edges of a small American town resting under a pale winter sky. Streetlights hummed above still pavement, and a distant gas station sign flickered between open and closed as if it could not decide which truth to show. Inside a narrow roadside diner, a woman named Ellen Vay sat alone in the last corner booth. She was not waiting for food. She was waiting for time to move. Anyone who noticed her that night would later struggle to explain why she felt different from the other late customers passing through. They remembered the untouched coffee growing cold between her hands. They remembered how she watched the dark window instead of the entrance door. Most of all, they remembered a strange calm around her shoulders. The kind of calm that does not belong to someone whose life is only minutes away from breaking apart. Because less than 1 mile from that diner, a quiet house stood in darkness. And inside that house, someone would soon stop breathing. When morning arrived, the story would form quickly. Clean, simple, believable. The kind of story small towns accept so everyday life can continue without fear or questions. But stories built too quickly often hide something underneath. Something patient. Something waiting for the right moment to be seen. Years later, a thin folder filled with photographs and measurements would reopen the silence of that winter night. Not through confession. Not through memory. But through blood. Blood does not forget direction. It does not forget height or movement. Even when people try to forget everything else. And when the patterns inside that quiet living room were studied again. The timeline everyone trusted began to bend. Only slightly at first. Like a reflection trembling on moving water. Then more. Until a question no one in that town wanted to ask slowly rose to the surface. What if the night everyone believed never truly happened the way they were told? The man who first allowed himself to think that question was not a detective and not a lawyer. He was not chasing fame or attention. His name was Corin Hale. A quiet forensic reconstruction specialist who spent most of his days inside windowless laboratories studying moments of violence long after the noise and emotion were gone. Corin preferred certainty. He trusted numbers more than memories and physics more than feelings. In his world, angles behaved honestly and gravity never lied. Yet the old evidence folder arrived on his desk anyway. A closed case. Years forgotten. No clear reason to look again. Except for one detail that refused to stay quiet. The blood on the living room wall moved in a direction that should not have been possible. At first, Corin assumed a simple documentation mistake. Older cases often carried small human errors. Measurements written in haste. Photographs taken from the wrong position. Reports completed by tired investigators close to sunrise. But the longer he studied the image, the quieter the room around him seemed to become. Because impossible patterns rarely appear alone. They usually protect something hidden. Across the same town, Ellen Vay still lived in a narrow apartment above a hardware store on the quiet main street. She had not left the town since that winter night years earlier. Not for travel. Not for opportunity. Not even for family. People often said grief can anchor a person to the exact place where everything changed. But Ellen did not look like someone drowning in grief. She looked like someone carefully holding her breath. Every morning she unlocked the store downstairs before sunrise. Every evening she closed the door at the same exact minute. Routine wrapped around her life like careful tape sealing a fragile box. No one questioned her stillness. Small towns learn to respect silence when silence behaves politely. Yet sometimes deep in the night, she woke suddenly from sleep with the same image frozen behind her eyes. A thin red line across pale painted wall. Moving the wrong way. She never spoke about it. Because the official story had already decided what was real. And changing reality in a small town can be more dangerous than keeping secrets. Corin first saw her only as a photograph clipped to the witness statements inside the case file. Last confirmed person to see the victim alive. Nothing unusual on paper. But something inside her expression resisted easy explanation. It was not sadness. Not shock. Not fear. It felt quieter than all of those. Like someone listening carefully for footsteps no one else could hear. He told himself the feeling meant nothing. Photographs freeze moments without context, and meaning often grows from imagination alone. Still, he kept looking. The victim was a local history teacher named Dareth Klein, 43 years old. No criminal record. No known enemies. A life most people would describe as ordinary right until the moment it suddenly ends. According to the official timeline, Dareth returned home shortly after 10 that night. Neighbors reported no argument, no struggle, and no visitors. The street remained silent. At 11:24, Elian placed a call to emergency services. Her voice sounded calm, measured, almost careful. She explained that Dareth had missed a scheduled meeting. She said she came to check on him. She said the front door was unlocked. She said she found him lying on the living room floor. Everything about the call sounded correct. Almost too correct. But correctness alone is never proof. Police arrived. Photographs were taken. Statements recorded. And within weeks the case closed. Official conclusion. A single fatal blow during what investigators believed was a brief personal conflict. No forced entry. No wider threat. A contained tragedy. Elian had been the last known person to see him alive. Yet there was not enough evidence to charge her. And without proof. The town chose peace over uncertainty. Years moved forward. Memories softened. Paper gathered dust in quiet storage. Until a flood inside the evidence room forced old boxes to be opened and preserved. Water does not care about closed stories. That was how the forgotten folder reached Corin Hale. Not through justice. Not through suspicion. But through accident. He almost ignored it. Another silent tragedy with no future. But the photograph of the wall would not stay ordinary. Blood projected outward. Yes. But the angle suggested the victim faced a different direction than investigators originally described. Which meant only two possibilities existed. Either the laws of motion changed for a single second inside a quiet living room. Or the story had changed instead. Corin leaned back slowly in his chair, listening to the low electrical hum above him. Feeling the familiar tension that appears when certainty begins to loosen. He understood the danger of reopening a finished timeline. Families forced to relive loss. Communities pulled back into doubt. Truth becoming heavier than comfort. Most investigators learn to avoid that weight once a case falls silent. But Corin had spent his life inside rooms where the past still whispered softly from walls and floors. He knew ignored details rarely disappear. They wait patiently. So he requested every remaining piece of evidence connected to that night. Every photograph. Every measurement. Every recorded second. Procedure allowed archival review. No one expected discovery. Least of all him. Across town. Elian felt the shift before any phone call or rumor arrived. Not through logic. Through something harder to explain. The quiet feeling that somewhere a locked door had opened. She stood alone in the darkened hardware store after closing, listening to pipes clicking behind the walls, watching slow dust moving through yellow light. For years she had lived inside careful stillness, believing stillness could keep the past asleep. But memory is patient. And truth even more patient. She did not know Corin Hale. She did not know the photographs were being studied again. She did not know the red line on the wall had begun to speak. Yet that night, for the first time in many years, sleep did not come. Back in the laboratory, Corin arranged the crime scene images across a long metal table. A frozen sequence from a room that no longer felt peaceful. He traced possible motion paths with a pencil. Measured the distance between droplets. Calculated the height between impact and collapse. Numbers slowly formed patterns. Patterns slowly formed questions. And one question refused to disappear. If the victim truly fell where the report claimed, why did the blood travel as if he had been standing somewhere else entirely? Corin whispered the thought into the empty room. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Like someone testing whether sound itself believed the idea. The laboratory offered no answer. Only silence. The same silence that had filled the house on the night of the death. He closed the folder gently, knowing that opening it again might change more than paperwork. Because timelines are fragile. Pull one thread, and entire years can begin to unravel. Outside, Soft snow started falling over the sleeping American town, covering streets, covering rooftops, covering the distance between past and present. But snow cannot hide what is already soaked into painted walls. And somewhere beneath that calm white silence, the truth of that winter night remained waiting, unmoved, unforgotten. Now only one question remained. If the blood pattern told a different story, who had written the first one? Morning arrived slowly over the town, not with noise, but with a thin grey light sliding across rooftops and empty streets. Nothing on the surface suggested that the past had begun to move again. Cars followed their usual routes. A delivery truck stopped at the diner. Someone unlocked the post office door at the same familiar hour. Ordinary routines continued, because ordinary life depends on believing yesterday is finished. Inside the laboratory, Corin Hale did not notice the sunrise. Fluorescent light erased time, turning night and morning into the same quiet color. The evidence photographs now covered nearly the entire metal table. Walls, floor, furniture, small objects frozen forever in their final positions. He studied them the way some people study maps before a long journey. Slowly, carefully, searching for a path no one else had seen. For years, the case summary had described a short confrontation near the center of the living room. A sudden strike. A collapse. Silence. Simple. Contained. Understandable. But simplicity can be misleading, especially when violence is involved. Corin focused again on the arc of blood droplets stretching toward the far wall. Each drop carried direction. Speed. Height. A silent record written in motion. Physics does not invent stories. It only records what truly happened. And the motion recorded here suggested movement across the room, not a fall straight downward, which meant the final seconds of Dareth Klein's life were already different from the official report. Corin felt a quiet pressure building behind his ribs. Not excitement. Not fear. Something closer to responsibility. Because once a timeline begins to change, someone must decide whether to keep pulling the thread. He opened the original witness statements again, reading slowly, listening for anything that felt unfinished. Most statements were short, predictable. Neighbors hearing nothing, seeing nothing, remembering nothing unusual. Small towns often protect themselves with silence, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Then he reached Eliane Vey's statement. Her words were calm, precise, almost careful in their balance. She described arriving at the house, noticing the unlocked door, calling out a name that did not answer, stepping into the living room, seeing the body on the floor. No extra emotion, no confusion, only sequence. At the time, investigators had described her composure as shock, a mind protecting itself from horror. But reading the words years later, Corin felt something else. Control. Not control over events, but control over memory, as if every sentence had been measured before it was spoken. He leaned back slowly, letting the thought settle without forcing it. Suspicion built too quickly can distort truth. He knew that. So he returned to the physical evidence, where emotion had no influence. Autopsy measurements. Impact angle. Estimated position of the attacker. One detail stood apart. A faint secondary stain near the hallway entrance. Barely mentioned in the report. Too small to matter at the time. But small details sometimes carry the heaviest meaning. Corin enlarged the photograph on his screen. Adjusted contrast. Studied the edges. The shape suggested contact transfer, not airborne spray, which meant someone or something carrying blood had moved toward the hallway. After the first impact, that motion did not exist in the official timeline. His breathing slowed, not from shock, but from the quiet realization that the night inside that house had been longer than anyone believed. Across town, Eliane opened the hardware store as she always did. The bell above the door rang with the same soft sound. Morning light touched shelves filled with tools no one urgently needed. Routine remained perfect on the outside. Yet inside, something restless had begun to move. She felt it in small ways. Forgetting where she placed a receipt. Pausing too long while counting change. Listening when no sound was present. The past was not supposed to return. Years had passed. Years were supposed to be enough. A customer spoke to her. She answered politely. Smiled at the correct moment. But her thoughts were somewhere else. Back in a living room washed in red and silence. Memory does not fade evenly. Some pieces remained sharp forever. By afternoon, clouds thickened above the town, pressing the sky lower, making the streets feel narrower. Inside the lab, Corin requested access to the original crime scene layout. Laser measurements taken the night of the death. Precise distances preserved in digital form. When the model appeared on his screen, the room looked almost peaceful. Just furniture. Walls. Ordinary space. Violence rarely changes a room as much as it changes time. He placed a virtual marker where the body had been found, then traced backward using the blood direction angles. Step by step, the reconstructed motion pulled the victim closer to the hallway, not the center of the room. Corin stopped moving the cursor, a quiet certainty settling into place. The first strike had not happened where everyone believed, which meant the struggle, if there had been one, began somewhere else. And if it began somewhere else, someone's memory was wrong, or incomplete, or rewritten. The realization did not feel dramatic. Truth rarely arrives with noise. It arrives like this. Slow, heavy, impossible to ignore once seen. Corin closed his eyes briefly, knowing the next step would move beyond simple review. Reopening a closed case required more than curiosity. It required reason strong enough to disturb the past. He looked again at Elian's photograph clipped beside the report. That quiet expression. That listening stillness. For the first time, he wondered not what she saw that night, but what she chose not to say. Evening approached. Streetlights flickered on one by one, the same way they had years earlier. Elian locked the store door at the exact same minute as always. Precision had become her shield. If every day matched the last, nothing new could enter. Yet as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, a feeling followed her. Soft, persistent, like footsteps stopping just before she turned around. Inside, the rooms were neat, undisturbed, frozen in careful order. She stood in the kitchen without turning on the light, listening to the quiet. 4 years' silence had protected her. Tonight, it felt different. Back in the lab, Corin printed the reconstructed motion sequence, paper sliding warm from the machine. He laid the pages beside the original photographs, past and present facing each other. 2 different stories, built from the same night. One of them had to be wrong. Outside the building, snow began falling again, thin at first, then steady, covering parking lots and empty sidewalks. Winter has a way of making time feel suspended, as if the world is holding its breath. Corin gathered the pages slowly, understanding something had already changed. He was no longer reviewing history. He was stepping into it. And once that step is taken, there is no clean way back to silence. Miles away, Elian sat awake in the dark, the same image returning behind her eyes. A red line across pale paint, moving in a direction it should not move. For years she had convinced herself memory could be shaped, smoothed, buried. But memory built on movement can never stay still forever. Somewhere in the town, unseen, unheard, the truth of that night was beginning to rise again. And neither of them yet understood how far it would reach, or what it would demand before the end. Because the deeper Corin followed the blood's direction, the closer he moved toward a question far more dangerous than who caused the death. The real question waiting ahead was quieter. Who changed the story afterward? Night settled over the town with a slow, heavy stillness. Snow covered the last traces of passing cars and softened every sharp edge of the streets. From a distance, everything looked peaceful, the kind of peace people trust without question. But inside 2 separate rooms, Sleep refused to come. Corin Hale remained in the laboratory long after the building should have been empty. The reconstructed motion sequence lay spread across the metal table like fragments of a broken map. Every line pointed toward the hallway. Away from the place investigators believed the final moment occurred. He had checked the math 3 times. Then again. Not searching for proof, but hoping for error. Error would have been easier. Error would have allowed the past to stay closed. Instead, the numbers stayed calm and certain. Physics repeating the same quiet answer. The first strike happened closer to the hallway. The body was moved. And time inside the official report did not match the time written in blood. Corin felt the familiar weight that arrives when evidence begins asking for action. Review could no longer remain neutral. Soon someone else would need to see what he was seeing. He understood what that meant. Phone calls. Questions. Old grief pulled back into daylight. He also understood something more personal. Once he stepped forward, he would become part of the story. For a long moment he stood motionless beside the table, listening to the low hum of electricity in the walls, trying to measure whether truth always deserved to be uncovered. Some cases bring justice. Others only bring pain with no clear ending. This one felt different. Quieter. More fragile. As if one wrong movement could break something that had stayed balanced for years. Across town, Elian Vey sat on the floor beside her bed with her back against the wall. The room was dark except for faint streetlights slipping through the curtains. She had not turned on a lamp. Light felt dangerous tonight. Her breathing stayed slow and controlled. The same control she had practiced every day since the winter night that changed everything. 4 years' routine had protected her. Predictable mornings. Predictable evenings. No surprises. No questions. But control depends on silence. And silence had begun to crack. She did not know why. Only that the feeling growing inside her chest was the same feeling she remembered from long ago. The moment before sound shattered the quiet living room. The moment before nothing could ever return to normal. Memory moved in fragments. A hand reaching. A voice unfinished. A shape falling out of sight. And always, the red line across pale paint. Moving wrong. Staying wrong. Refusing to fade. She pressed her eyes closed as if darkness could push the images away. It did not. Because memory is not stored in sight alone. It lives in muscle. In breath. In the small pauses between thoughts. Somewhere deep inside. She understood a truth she had avoided for years. The past was no longer staying buried. Back in the laboratory, Corin opened the final section of archived material. Items investigators once believed unimportant. Personal photographs from the house. Receipts. A handwritten note found near the kitchen counter. Ordinary objects often survive where answers do not. One photograph held his attention longer than the others. Taken earlier on the night of the incident during routine documentation. The hallway light was on. Faint. Yellow. Barely reaching the living room. But in the later photographs, that same light was off. The report never mentioned when the light changed. Corin studied the timestamps. A small detail. Easy to ignore. Yet time inside a crime scene behaves like gravity. Even the smallest shift can change everything. If the hallway light had been on during the first strike, someone must have turned it off later, which meant movement after the moment investigators believed the event ended. His chest tightened slightly. Not from fear, but from recognition. The timeline was not simply wrong. It was incomplete. And incomplete stories rarely happen by accident. He walked to the window at the end of the lab. Snow falling steadily beyond the glass. Quiet. Endless. Almost gentle. For the first time since opening the folder, he allowed himself to imagine the human moment behind the evidence. A living room. 2 people. Words spoken that could not be taken back. Violence is rarely sudden. It grows from something already breaking. If the body had been moved, if the light had been changed, then someone remained in that house longer than the official story allowed. Someone thinking, choosing, deciding what the world would later believe. The thought stayed with him as he returned to the table. Heavy. Unavoidable. Across town. Elian finally stood from the floor and walked slowly into the kitchen. Each step careful, as if the apartment itself might react to sudden motion. She filled a glass with water but did not drink. Her hands remained steady. Years of practice had taught them stillness. On the counter rested a small cardboard box sealed with clear tape. Untouched for a long time. She stared at it without moving. Inside were objects she had promised herself never to see again. Not evidence. Not exactly. Just pieces of a night that refused to disappear completely. For years she had believed leaving the box closed meant leaving the past closed. Now she was no longer certain. Her fingers brushed the edge of the tape. Then stopped. Opening it would change something. Even if nothing inside had moved. Silence filled the kitchen. Deep. Pressing. Waiting. She stepped back instead. Choosing distance. Choosing delay. But delay is not escape. And somewhere inside she knew time was running out. Back in the lab. Corin made the decision he had been avoiding since morning. He documented the inconsistencies. Blood direction. Body position. Light change. Secondary transfer stain. Each detail clear. Measured. Impossible to ignore once written together. When he finished, the report felt heavier than its pages should allow. Because this was the moment the past would begin moving in the real world again. He looked once more at the photograph of Elian Vey. That quiet listening expression frozen in time. For years she had lived untouched by new questions. Protected by the certainty of a closed case. That protection was about to end. Corin did not feel triumph. Only responsibility. And a quiet uncertainty about what truth might cost both of them. Outside, snow continued falling over the sleeping town. Covering roads. Covering roofs. Covering footprints no one remembered making. Winter silence can feel endless. Until the first sound breaks it. Corin picked up the phone. Then paused. Because one thought had begun to grow beneath all the evidence. A thought more unsettling than any measurement. What if the changed timeline did not point to hidden guilt? What if it pointed to hidden protection instead? The idea stayed with him. Unanswered. Dangerous in a different way. Slowly, he lowered the phone back onto the desk. Not yet. Some truths require one final piece before they can be spoken aloud. Miles away, Elian stood alone in her dark apartment, listening to the same silence, feeling the same approaching shift. Neither of them knew the exact moment everything would finally surface. Only that it was close. Very close. Because the next discovery waiting inside the evidence would not just change the timeline of a death. It would change the meaning of that night entirely. The next morning did not feel different. Sunlight still reached slowly across the quiet streets. Snow still rested along rooftops and sidewalks in soft white silence. From the outside the town looked untouched by time. But inside the laboratory, and inside a small apartment above a hardware store, everything had already begun to change. Corin Hale arrived before sunrise. He had not truly slept, only drifted in and out of shallow thoughts where evidence and memory blended together. The report he completed during the night rested on his desk, neatly stacked, calm on the surface, yet heavy with consequences. For hours he simply looked at it, not reading, just understanding what would happen once the pages left his hands. Closed cases carry a fragile peace. Reopening them breaks more than silence. Still, truth does not measure comfort before revealing itself. He exhaled slowly and reached again for the final envelope of archived material. The one section he had not fully reviewed. Inside were items collected but never deeply examined. Objects considered emotionally irrelevant to the official conclusion. Among them lay a small digital recorder. Bagged. Labeled. Almost forgotten. Corin frowned slightly. The evidence log described it as inactive. No usable audio recovered at the time. But technology years ago was not what it is now. And sometimes silence only means no one listened closely enough. He connected the device to updated forensic software. the screen filled with faint static lines, broken fragments of sound buried beneath distortion. At first, nothing clear emerged, only noise shaped like distant wind. He adjusted filters, removed interference, pulled the waveform apart layer by layer. Minutes passed, then more, and slowly, a shape formed inside the sound. Not words yet, just rhythm. 2 movements, 2 breaths. Corin leaned closer to the screen, his pulse steady but focused. The recorder had captured something after the moment investigators believed everything ended, which meant the night inside that house had continued longer than anyone knew. He refined the audio again, carefully, patiently. Then finally, a voice surfaced, soft, unsteady, close to the microphone. Not shouting, not arguing, whispering. The words were incomplete, broken by static. Yet one phrase became clear enough to understand. A single sentence, spoken with quiet urgency. "I didn't mean." The rest dissolved into distortion. Corin froze, not because the sentence proved guilt, but because of what followed. Another sound entered the recording. Not a voice, a movement, fabric shifting, weight dragging across the floor. The exact motion the blood pattern had already described. He closed his eyes briefly, the pieces aligning with a calm certainty that felt almost unreal. The body had been moved, not in panic during violence, but afterward, during silence, which meant someone remained in that room, alive, thinking, choosing. The timeline was no longer uncertain. It was rewritten. Across town, Elian Vey stood in her kitchen holding the same unopened cardboard box. Morning light filled the room gently, too peaceful for the memories pressing against her chest. She had felt the change the moment she woke, like air shifting before a storm arrives. For years she had lived between 2 versions of the same night, the one the town believed, and the one that never stopped replaying behind her eyes. She understood now that distance was ending. Her fingers moved slowly across the tape sealing the box. This time, they did not stop. The sound of tearing adhesive felt louder than it should. Sharp in the quiet room. Inside lay only a few objects. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked important. A folded photograph. A set of keys. And a thin strip of fabric stained dark with time. She stared at the fabric longest, breathing shallow, memory rising whether she allowed it or not. Because the truth of that night had never been a single moment of violence. It had been the moment after. Back in the lab, Corin replayed the recovered audio again, and again, each time hearing more detail inside the silence. Not anger, not hatred, fear, and beneath the fear, something else. Protection. The realization came quietly, almost gently. What if the rewritten timeline was never meant to hide a killer? What if it was meant to protect someone already lost in another way? He opened the original case summary once more, reading not as an investigator, but as a human being searching for motive deeper than crime. Dareth Klein, history teacher. No enemies. No record of violence. Elian Vey, last person to see him alive. Calm, careful, silent for years. 2 lives connected by something the file never explained. Corin felt the final distance closing. The answer no longer hidden in physics or sound, but in choice. Someone had moved the body, turned off the hallway light, reshaped the story, not to escape justice, but to control what the world would believe about the final seconds of a man's life. Across town, Elian sank slowly into a chair, the stained fabric still in her hands. Her voice barely existed when she finally allowed the memory to speak inside her mind. There had been no argument, no sudden rage, only a confession. Soft, unexpected, too heavy to hold. Dareth had told her something that night. Something about illness, about time running out, about not wanting the town to remember weakness. The fall had been an accident, a moment of dizziness, a strike against the edge of the table. Not violence, just gravity, and the fragile limits of a human body. He had still been breathing when she knelt beside him. Barely. Fading. And with the last strength he had. He asked for one thing. Not to be remembered as someone who collapsed alone in fear, but as someone taken quickly, cleanly, without pity. She had tried to refuse, tried to call for help sooner, but his eyes had held hers, certain, peaceful in a way she could not fight. So when silence finally filled the room, she made a choice that would follow her for the rest of her life. She moved him, changed the light, spoke carefully on the phone, not to hide a crime, but to protect dignity. Tears slipped down her face now without resistance. Years of stillness breaking quietly. Back in the laboratory, Corin understood the same truth without ever hearing her thoughts. The evidence no longer pointed toward murder. It pointed toward mercy shaped by impossible grief. He sat down slowly, the weight inside his chest different now. Not urgency, not suspicion, understanding. Some truths do not bring justice or blame, only sorrow, and the fragile kindness people try to give each other at the end. Outside, snow began melting under pale sunlight, water tracing slow paths along the street, time moving forward again. Corin looked at the report on his desk, then at the recovered audio, then at the photograph of Elian Vey. For the first time since opening the case, he knew exactly what the truth was. The only question left was whether the world needed to hear it. For a long time, Corin Hale did nothing. The laboratory around him remained quiet except for the faint electrical hum that never truly stopped. Morning light had fully replaced the darkness outside the windows. Yet the room still felt suspended between two different times. On the desk in front of him rested three simple things: the written report, the recovered audio file, and the photograph of a woman who had carried silence for years. None of them looked powerful. None of them looked capable of changing lives. But truth rarely looks powerful at first glance. It waits, patient, until someone decides what to do with it. Corin leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes tired but clear. He had spent his career believing that every hidden fact deserved daylight, that evidence existed to correct the past, that accuracy was a form of justice. Now the certainty he trusted felt less solid, because this truth was different. No violence to punish, no danger to prevent, no future victim waiting for protection. Only a private promise made in the final breaths of a dying man, and the quiet loyalty of the person who chose to honor it. If he submitted the full reconstruction, the case would reopen. Headlines would return. Strangers would debate a night they never lived. And dignity, the one thing the dying man had asked to keep, would disappear forever. Corin closed his eyes, not to escape the decision, but to feel its full weight without distraction. Somewhere deep in memory, he thought about the reason he entered forensic work at all. Not curiosity, not recognition, but the belief that truth could help the living continue forward. This truth would not help anyone continue. It would only pull two finished lives back into pain. He opened his eyes again, the answer waiting quietly where it had been all along. Truth is not only about what is accurate. Sometimes it is about what is humane. Across town, Elian Vey sat motionless at her small kitchen table, the cardboard box still open beside her. Morning had passed into afternoon without her noticing. For years she had imagined this moment in different ways. Police at the door, questions she could no longer avoid, the past breaking open without warning. Instead, there was only silence. No footsteps on the stairs, no phone call, no sound except her own breathing slowly finding rhythm again. She did not know about the recovered recording. She did not know about the reconstructed timeline. She did not know that somewhere nearby, a stranger now understood the truth she had carried alone. Yet something inside her felt lighter, not safe, not free, but closer to rest. Because secrets change shape over time. At first they feel like protection, then like weight, and finally like something waiting to be released. She looked down at the stained strip of fabric in her hands. For the first time in years, she did not see fear. She saw farewell. Tears came again. Quiet. Unforced. Grief delayed is still grief. It only waits for permission. Back in the laboratory, Corin moved with calm certainty. He opened a new document. Not the full reconstruction. Not the complete explanation. Only a brief technical note. Evidence degradation over time. Audio corruption beyond reliable interpretation. Blood pattern distortion due to environmental factors. Neutral language. Accurate enough to be accepted. Gentle enough to let the past remain closed. He read the words twice, ensuring they contained no direct lie, only the absence of deeper detail. Then he saved the file, printed it, and placed it where the official record required. The longer report. The true one. He did not submit. Instead, he folded the pages carefully, returned them to the envelope, and locked them inside a personal archive drawer that required no external review. Not hidden in fear, protected in choice, because sometimes the final responsibility of knowing the truth is deciding who else truly needs to carry it. Evening approached slowly. Snow along the streets had melted into thin reflective water. Streetlights flickered on one by one. The same quiet rhythm the town had followed for years. Corin stepped outside the building, cold air filling his lungs, the world moving normally around him. No sign that history had almost changed. He began walking without clear direction, just letting distance settle the thoughts still echoing in his chest. After several blocks, he noticed the small hardware store on the corner. Lights glowing warm inside. Ordinary. Peaceful. He stopped across the street. Not crossing. Not entering. Just looking. Through the window he could see Elian behind the counter, speaking softly to an elderly customer. Her movements calm. Familiar. Unaffected. No one inside that store knew how close the past had come to returning. No one knew a stranger now carried the truth of the hardest night of her life. Corin felt no need to introduce himself. No need to reveal what he knew. Understanding did not require recognition. Some kindness exists best when unseen. After a moment, he turned and continued walking, footsteps fading into the quiet sound of evening traffic. Inside the store, Elian watched the door close after the last customer left, the bell's soft ring lingering in the air. For a reason she could not explain, she felt compelled to look out the window. Across the street, only empty sidewalk remained. Yet a strange calm settled over her shoulders. Gentle, unexpected, as if something unfinished had finally reached its end. She did not know why, but for the first time in many years, the memory of that night felt still, not chasing her, not demanding to be relived, just resting where the past belongs. Night returned fully, covering the town in familiar darkness. But this darkness felt different from the 1 year ago. That night had held fear, confusion, an ending without meaning. This night held quiet acceptance. Two strangers, connected only by truth, moved forward in separate silence. One carrying knowledge, the other finally free from its weight. And somewhere beyond both of them, the memory of a man named Dareth Klein remained untouched by rumor or spectacle. Not defined by weakness, not reduced to tragedy, only remembered, quietly, by the one person who stayed beside him at the end. Time continued, as it always does, days passing into weeks, winter softening toward spring. Nothing in the town's routine revealed what had almost surfaced. No headlines, no reopened doors, just life, moving gently forward. Months later, Corin would sometimes think about the case, not with doubt, not with regret, but with a quiet question that had no single answer. What is truth truly for? To expose, to punish, to correct, or sometimes, simply to understand, and then let go. He never spoke of the decision to anyone. Because some choices lose meaning when explained aloud. They exist only in the silent space between knowledge and mercy. And in a small apartment above a hardware store, Ellie and Vay would one day notice something subtle. She could sleep through the night again. No red line across pale paint. No unfinished breath in the darkness. Just rest. The kind of rest that arrives. Not when the past disappears, but when it is finally allowed to remain where it ended. The winter night that once defined everything slowly became only a memory among many others. Still important. Still sad. But no longer alive. And in the quiet distance between two lives that would never meet, the truth remained exactly where it needed to be. Known. Understood. And gently. Kept silent. Final thought. Not every hidden story is waiting to be told. Some are waiting to be carried with care. So that dignity, not exposure, becomes the final ending.